500 people takes a while.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the attendee number.
The other thing we never know is just how many people in the room.
Yeah,
the attendees.
and that might not be a don't trust me on that being a metric.
David, please start.
Okay. Atamawe and good morning. Welcome to the 10th series of BDO Rethink, and it's BDO's privilege to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister, the Hon Grant Robertson, to our series this morning. As you know, the Deputy Prime Minister is also Minister of Finance and Minister of Sport, but we're focusing on finance today. In particular, we've asked the Minister to talk about post the budget and post probably the aftermath of feedback and discussion on that, his views on policies going forward, his views on particularly the mid-market space where BDO acts for so many of you. So we welcome the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and we'll hand it over to you to take off.
Well, tēnā koe, David. Ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. Greetings, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here and really looking forward to taking your questions and having as good an interactive discussion as you can have by virtual means. But I know this means we can have a large number of people attend, and I'm looking forward to the feedback that I get. What I thought I'd do this morning is break my comments into three parts. The first of those is to give my reckons around where we are in terms of the global economic situation and New Zealand's economic situation. Secondly, looking particularly at some of the COVID-related issues. I know for many of you, labour supply and supply chain issues are very significant, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing in that space. And then thirdly, the areas that we focused on in the budget about our recovery and our rebuild, especially with a focus around infrastructure and the work that we're doing to try to make sure that we lock in the gains that New Zealand has had through COVID and do better in the areas where I think a return to normal isn't actually what we want. Spend a lot of time over the last year trying to get ourselves back to normal, and by which I mean, you know, meeting our friends and family, going to work, getting the kids off to school. That normal is something that we all aspire to. But when it comes to the economy, some of what was normal before we got to COVID could be better, and so we've got a real focus on going forward on a more sustainable and more prosperous economy. If I start with a look at the overall economic situation, I think the good news for New Zealand is we find ourselves in a much stronger place than we expected to be. So at this point, the forecasters were telling us we were likely to have unemployment of around 10%. In reality, we've ended up with 4.7%, and that is trending down, and as I say, relates to some of the labour supply issues that I'll come back to in a minute. But it is a sign of an economy that's been resilient and that has recovered well. One of the things we're very pleased about in terms of our contribution to that was the wage subsidy scheme. We put that out with the idea of two very core principles in mind: cash flow and confidence. We did it quickly, we did it in bulk to give people time to make decisions and not have to make precipitous decisions. And I think that's worked for us by retaining the attachment of people to their jobs and to the firms that they work for. When we look around the rest of the world, that unemployment level of 4.7% compares very well. Our friends across the ditch are about 5.5%, and globally the OECD average is over 6%. So we think that's been a really good basis for us to move forward from, and that intervention I think was very helpful, along with a number of other supports that we were able to put in place for business, the small business cash flow loan scheme, the business finance guarantee scheme that we worked with the banks on, and a number of other targeted support measures that we put in place. So we're very pleased. Unemployment is a measure that we take very seriously, and we're pleased to see that result. The second thing that we can look at is around broader GDP numbers. And while we've had a great deal of volatility, which everyone in the world has faced, the latest quarterly numbers look pretty good. And the other indicators that feed into GDP, things like retail sales and so on, are maintaining very high levels at this stage, again, well ahead. And we can put the marker down and say that economic activity is now back to pre-COVID levels, again, well ahead of where we thought we would be and well ahead of where most other countries are, and that's given us this good start. And finally, the other metric, being New Zealanders, we like external validation. Standard & Poor's have given us a ratings upgrade, the first one that they gave in the pandemic period, and the first one for New Zealand since 2003 up to AAA. And they did that on the basis that they think the fundamentals of the New Zealand economy are sound. They think that the fiscal approach that the government is taking is a balanced one, and that we've got good prospects for our recovery and our rebuild. And so those three metrics combined make me feel that we're in a good place. But it's not to say that everything is perfect in the economy, and I'll return to some of the issues that we're working on there in a moment. When we then look at the broader global economic situation, again, we can see a speedier recovery and a greater recovery than had been expected, but with a tremendous amount of uncertainty and volatility within that. There is not a piece of economic forecasting or a report that comes across my desk that doesn't include the words uncertainty and volatility. And we have to accept that that is the world that we're living in. And so, yep, we're seeing the US economy bouncing back a little better than we expected. But the cross-cutting issue across that is the Delta variant and the impact of third and fourth waves of the virus on the societies and the economies that are experiencing that. And so underpinning that is problems. There's also the broader geopolitical issues which never go away. And from New Zealand's perspective, as a country that has an independent foreign policy that looks to a world where we need strong trade agreements, we need free and open flows of trade. It's important for us that we maintain good relationships across the board, but also learn a lesson from COVID there, which is around the diversification of our markets and the diversification of what we sell into those markets. And that's a big piece of work for us. Just as an aside, because I probably won't come back to it in my further remarks, the work we're doing around free trade agreements continues. We sent Damien O'Connor off as the first minister to leave our shores in recent times to go up to Europe and the UK to forge on with those agreements. We're optimistic about them coming through. New Zealand has a strong bipartisan record around trade agreements, that we sign good quality trade agreements. We're not here just to sign an agreement for the image and the politics of it. We want it to be meaningful for our exporters, to make sure that we're creating good opportunities. It wouldn't take a rocket scientist, or perhaps I should say an agricultural scientist, to think about what the issues might be when we're having a free trade discussion with the UK and the EU, but we are making progress, and we're optimistic that we'll have something more definitive to say about that pretty soon. So that global environment leads me to the second of my points, and that is around the impact of COVID. And I do think, despite what we would all want, we have to accept that the pandemic is far from over. And you only need to watch the news, and I'm sure you all do, to see that we are now experiencing those further waves and those further variants of the virus that are very, very hard to manage. And places that we've looked to in the recent past for how they've managed the pandemic are really struggling. So Taiwan last week had 804 cases of COVID-19. This is now a problem, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, Indonesia, Malaysia, other places that are experiencing big outbreaks, Thailand, and then obviously very close to home in Fiji. And the situation in Fiji is distressing and dire. New Zealand and Australia are doing what we can to support Fiji, but they are unfortunately the very thing that worried people about COVID-19 is the overwhelming of the health system. And seeing that in Fiji, as I say, is distressing, but it is a lesson for all of us around what can happen with COVID. And then very clearly, very close to home in Sydney, we've got the outbreak there and the restrictions that inevitably come with that outbreak. So that context of COVID is very, very challenging for us, but it doesn't mean that we stop what we're doing to continue to find ways to enable both the economy to thrive, but also us to do what is effectively our #1 job, and that is to keep New Zealanders safe from COVID-19. On that score, that means that we will continue to have restrictions for some time. But what we can do is look to the ways that we can use our vaccination program to reduce those restrictions. And the Prime Minister and myself have talked in the last couple of days about some of the work we're doing there, and I'll just very briefly outline that for you today before moving on to some of the more detailed matters. Essentially, the core of what we can do and how we can start to reduce our reliance on managed isolation and quarantine for all travellers and the restrictions that we use is vaccination. Because once we can see a large part of the New Zealand population vaccinated, it starts to give us options. Our vaccination program has been different than ones in other parts of the world because we weren't facing, to be brutally frank, large numbers of deaths. We were in a situation where we were largely free of COVID, so we could learn lessons from the rest of the world. Vaccinate our border staff first, vaccinate our health staff second, our vulnerable people third, and then the rest of the population. Secondly, we've taken a single vaccine approach, and I stand by that decision. The Pfizer vaccine's efficacy is at the top of the charts. It means there is no debate in New Zealand about what vaccine you might want to have or not want to have. You're getting one of the very best, and that means that it will roll out and we will meet, I am very confident, our goal of having every New Zealander who wants to be vaccinated by the end of the year. But it requires all of us to get involved. It also relies on a delivery schedule, which we continually work with Pfizer on, but as I say, I'm confident we'll reach that goal. What that then does is give us some options. And over the last 2 or 3 months, we've been working with the expert advisors, our public health advisors, our modelers, business liaison people through the likes of Rob Fife, and also with the people who help with the logistics of what happens at our border. And what we're working towards is putting all of that advice out for you to see and to hear directly from those experts in about a month's time. And at the same time, we'll give you the government's response to that. I can't go into the detail of that today because it's still being finalised, but what we are looking to do is find ways of ensuring we protect our people, but start to reduce some of those restrictions that we've got at the border using a smart border approach to be able to open up more space. There's a pretty obvious consequence of that. If we reduce our reliance on all travellers needing MIQ, that opens up further spaces, for example, for critical workers to come in, which I know is an issue in a lot of the industries that you work in. So all of that will come through in about a month's time, but I wanted you to know we are continuing to work on that. That also includes working on places where we might be able to have travel bubbles a la what we have with Australia and the Cook Islands. Clearly at the moment, it's a challenging area with the Delta variant, but we are still looking for places where we are confident and where it is safe to be able to develop those sorts of options along with the rest of the work that we're doing. Finally, before I move on to some of the recovery and rebuild aspects of what we're focused on at the moment, I want to acknowledge up front 2 of the major issues that are affecting businesses, especially those that the BDO work with, and that is labour supply issues and supply chain issues. The reality that we have is that clearly inward migration is at a level that a very low level and not one that we've experienced before. And we've been acutely aware of that. That's why we have created the critical worker exemptions, and 17,000 of those critical workers have come into New Zealand. But as the economy grows beyond the expectations that we all had, it is putting pressure on that. I want you to know that we're working with industry groups, with our immigration officials, with our border officials, as to how we can continually increase the number of people that we can bring in. We want to do this as a partnership, and it's very important for us that the other side of the coin is being worked on at the same time, and that is clearly pay and conditions, and making sure that we do provide the opportunities for New Zealanders to take up work. While unemployment is very low, our underutilisation rate, that's people who want to work more, remains quite high. It's up over 10% regularly. And so we do need to think about what are the opportunities there are for more flexible approaches that will allow people to re-enter the workforce or take on more hours of work. Also, we want to be in partnership in skills training and development, and the government has really put its best foot forward there. One of the policies I'm most proud of is the free apprenticeships and targeted trade training policy that we brought in. Over 135,000 New Zealanders have taken that up, and that includes well over 70,000 new apprentices. We've got our apprenticeship boost program, which has supported over 10,000 businesses to keep their apprentices on, as well as take on the new ones that we're subsidising. And that's really important in sectors like construction, I know, where we've seen a real boost in that area. We want to be in partnership around a skills training plan with industry and around that plan around what we're doing to encourage New Zealand workers in, and then also acknowledge that we need to be bringing labour in from offshore as well. So it's a two-way street, but it's one that we're committed to working on and expanding the number of people we get there, as well as that broader border work that will open up more spaces and potential places for people coming in. But we are going to have restrictions for some time. Professor Sir David Skegg, who leads one of our public health advisory groups, likes to draw the analogy of saying that after 9/11, the borders changed, and similarly with COVID, we can't expect things to go back to exactly how they were, certainly not in a short period of time, but we can do more to be able to increase labour supply that's coming in. There's a broader immigration reset that's also taking place. That's about taking the opportunity now to look at all of our immigration settings and say, are they contributing to an immigration policy that lifts productivity, that lifts prosperity, that adds value? We're going to do that work over a period. It'll be a transition, but in the short term, we recognise we've got these pressures that we do need to use the immigration system to help relieve. And then secondly, on the supply chain issues, these are global issues, and unfortunately they're going to take a considerable time to resolve, particularly when it comes to shipping. And all of you will know freight timelines are volatile and longer than they have been. We've got a group of supply chain ministers who meet regularly with our officials, who talk to the main shipping companies and other transport companies, and we're doing everything we can to relieve pressures on our own ports. But the global issues are unfortunately beyond our control. Give you a couple of examples. In China, there was an outbreak that you hardly heard about in Shenzhen. It basically shut the port in Shenzhen for a couple of months. All of you, if anyone's ever been to that port, I have, it is crazy. And if it's not processing people, that will affect and ripple right through the Asia Pacific region. There's an irony in the US economy recovering a little bit, is that they want all the containers back, and so it's harder to actually make sure that we've got that supply of containers too. But again, rest assured, everything we can do and we are doing, but there are global issues there that are going to last for some time. On air freight, we've continued our subsidy scheme for air freight, which has underwritten 7,000 flights to the tune of about 136,000 tonnes of freight and about $10 billion worth of exports that have gone out on planes that wouldn't have otherwise come here because they don't have people on them anymore. And we're continuing that scheme and continuing to support that ability for our exporters to work. And our exporters have done some huge heavy lifting in this period of time, and we've helped underwrite that. So very aware of those issues. Happy to take any other questions you've got about those. Just in the time remaining, I just want to talk about the core focus for the government around recovery and rebuild that came out of the budget. And a big focus for us is on what we do to be able to lift New Zealand's productivity and make sure we tackle that decades-long challenge. The core of that are 3 or 4 areas. I've mentioned our external relationships and trade. I've mentioned skills. The two that I just want to dwell on now are infrastructure and access to capital. On infrastructure, the budget contains a pipeline of spending of $57 billion over the next 5 years. That's central government spending, let alone what everybody else is doing, particularly at a local government level. That's across the board. That's everything from transport to housing to hospitals to schools, etc. We are, as everybody is, facing those constraints I've just talked about, and so the timelines of some projects get pushed out a little bit. But one of the things I've heard consistently over my time as Finance Minister and before is the importance of a pipeline, and that's what we've now got. And the work of the Infrastructure Commission to produce the 30-year infrastructure strategy adds on to that, and that will be presented to government later in the year on the basis of the consultation that's been going on lately. That pipeline of work means that there is some certainty about what's coming down, certainly from central government, but we do still want to look to ways of how we can speed that up, in particular how we can crowd in private capital to be able to support what we're doing in certain parts of that infrastructure spend. So our Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act that we passed last year helps create the framework for how we can do that using special purpose vehicles. But we want to continue to find ways of developing that using the good offices of the Crown Infrastructure Partners Group and others to look for those opportunities to be able to speed up and create some new infrastructure, particularly in the areas of housing and transport. Alongside that, you'll be aware that the government's bitten off a couple of fairly large reform processes, in particular the reforms to our three waters and to the RMA and our planning laws. They are both hugely important underpinnings of good infrastructure in New Zealand. And so that work goes on. They are big pieces of work. Both of them we will be looking to see largely the bedrocks of them completed by the end of this term. New planning laws will be something that everyone will look forward to. The RMA has stopped working for everybody, and we now need to make sure that it does its job of protecting the environment but enabling development at the same time. Three waters is a very complicated area, but if you live in Wellington like I do, it's quite simple. We'd rather our pipes actually worked properly and that we didn't have regular disruptions. We all want to make sure that works better, and that is a big piece of reform that we'll have a bit more to say about later in the week at the Local Government New Zealand conference. And then finally, in that kind of broad area of infrastructure is just the importance we put on partnerships. And if we think about housing, there is huge opportunity for us here, and that's why we put in place the Housing Acceleration Fund in the budget. That's $3.8 billion for us to do a job of getting land to be build ready. And the thing we've heard from local government, from iwi and from private sector developers is give us build ready land and we'll get the houses on it. And so the pipes, the drains, the internal roads, that's what that money's for. And we're looking to do that with local government, but also with other players. And it's a theme actually for the government around partnership for development. I think one of the areas we haven't realised the potential of is the post-treaty settlement iwi economy, where there are real opportunities for investment together, not only in areas like housing, but across the board. And the government wants to play its part in moving forward from there. Finally, in this section, just want to recognise one of the issues, one of the lessons that we've learned out of COVID is around where access to capital sits, especially for small and medium enterprises. What we've seen and what I'm told constantly is that the world's awash with capital. And I think that's true at the bigger end of town, but I think when I look to SMEs in particular, that's not always the case, particularly for startups, particularly for people who are trying to move forward in their business. And we all know the story, and many of you will have been part of it, of the first mortgage and then the second mortgage that gets you going. We're trying to make that a little bit easier because we want to see those firms grow and we want to see them turn into where they can be, to export businesses, but certainly into growing businesses. So Minister Stuart Nash and I are doing a piece of work at the moment around access to capital for SMEs and for medium-sized, up into the medium to larger sized businesses as well. We did have the Business Finance Guarantee Scheme. That's now finished. It had an interesting lifespan. It eventually worked, but it certainly highlighted some of those issues around how we move forward in terms of supporting businesses to grow. So very happy to take questions or do any further work on that with people who are interested in it. And then I'll just finish on a couple of the other issues that we focused on in the budget that I haven't mentioned so far. So I have mentioned housing in the context of that, those changes that we are making around the build ready land. We're also increasing access to first home grants, but we have also intervened on the demand side of the ledger, and I know that's not a universally popular policy, but the truth is that unless we do that, we are going to make home ownership a very difficult proposition for a very long time. And so we are looking to tilt the balance towards first home buyers and away from speculators and investors. And we've obviously put the interest deductibility policy and the bright line policy in place. Clearly, I don't hold all the cards on that. The Reserve Bank holds some of them as well, and they're an independent outfit. But altogether, monetary and fiscal policy, I think, need to work together to support us, giving more New Zealanders the opportunity of getting into their first home. The other area that you would have heard a lot about in the budget was around issues to do with inequality and child poverty. That remains a very important focus for the government. We did lift benefits significantly in the budget that got very out of whack with the cost of living, and we think that was the right thing to do. But associated with that were a number of other changes to support parents and others who are in low incomes back into work, the reinstatement of the training incentive allowance, allowing people who are working to keep more of their benefit while they work to encourage people back into the workforce, and a number of other issues there. It remains vitally important to us in terms of our wellbeing approach that we continue to focus on reducing child poverty and increasing child wellbeing. And then finally, and I'll make this my last point, the overarching issue of climate change. Climate change will be the defining economic, social and environmental issue of my political lifetime, I'm sure. And the report of the Independent Climate Commission that came out just after the budget, I think is a hugely important document, partly because the Zero Carbon Act means that the government must respond to it, and we've got a timeline to do that by the end of the year. The core element of that are the carbon budgets and the emissions reductions plans, sector by sector, that we need to meet the goals that we've set ourselves around reducing emissions. They're ambitious goals, but they're goals that we are committed to. What the emissions reductions plan process do is enable us to look sector by sector at the change we need to make. I want to assure you of two things today. The first is that we're committed to doing this. The second is that we're committed to doing it in partnership and in a way, using the phrase that we use, that is a just transition. We need to be able to bring people with us here. And if I look at, for example, the agriculture sector, there is, I know, a huge willingness in that sector to do the right thing here, but a desire to be able to do that in a way that it protects the incomes of our rural sector as we move forward. And so we are looking very closely at how we can do that. I think it's in areas like transport and industrial heat where you will see, significant changes over the next couple of 10 to 15 years that we all need to focus on and work together on. But I want this to be one where we also look at opportunity. And there is huge opportunity for us in the new technologies that will be required to enable the world to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We need to be seizing those opportunities. And so we've got a series of industry transformation plans. We've done one in agri-tech, we're doing one in digital and advanced manufacturing that are about how we can create those high wage, low carbon jobs that are going to be the future of New Zealand. That requires a partnership approach, a just transition approach in Taranaki and in Southland. We want to keep rolling out and expanding to create those opportunities. The New Zealand Green Investment Fund was created a couple of budgets back. We've given that an extra $300 million, and its job is to crowd private capital in to the development of those new technologies and those opportunities that we have to lower emissions. And New Zealanders have a great base to work from here. If you think about agriculture, you think about manufacturing, but we can build on that now to be at the cutting edge of how the world reduces its emissions and meets its climate change goals. So while there are changes and there are going to be burdens on the economy, there is also significant opportunity that we want to invest in the next couple of budgets. We'll show a bit more of that. So look, that's a broad skate, David, through where I see things. I recognise that while these are challenging times for many businesses, we do also have to reflect the fact that New Zealand's done well here, and that most of the economic indicators, we're well ahead of other countries. We get to operate in a relatively normal way in our lives. We need to protect that, but at the same time, we need to work together to make sure that we deal with the problems that that's creating for us.
Great summary, thanks Minister. Already questions are firing through.
I'm quite sure they are.
So I'll take one that you'll know this fellow, Jared Kerr from Kiwi Bank. And it's probably in connection with access to capital. The government's finances in a much better position. Revenue forecasts from May were undercooked. You have a lot more headroom to tackle your plans. I feel the May budget could have done more for SMEs. He's talking about our market around investing, hiring and adapting. Any plans to expand plans for the SMEs? And you've talked a bit about the access to capital. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure.
What you're thinking?
Yeah, I'll just take a step back to, which I'm sure Jared will appreciate, that I will just give a plug for what we did do in the budget in terms of SMEs, and we were building on the significant support that had been provided through COVID-19 in terms of things like the small business cash flow scheme and the wage subsidy scheme and so on. But one of the big lessons we got from COVID-19 was the importance of enabling our small and medium enterprises to have a digital presence, because that is clearly now going to be more important than ever. So the Digital Boost program is now underway, and we added money to that to, I think, enable around about 60,000 businesses to be supported to get their online presence going, to understand how that works, to get both technical but also physical support for how to make that happen. And so really encourage any of you who are out there who are interested in that area. It's a good product. MB are the government agency who are behind it, but it does offer real opportunities, and it was a very specific area that we knew we needed to do more on, and we will continue to invest in. Beyond that, yeah, absolutely. And so I guess what we're saying with the work we're doing around with SMEs is it involves Jared's bosses as well as us, that we want our trading banks to primarily be the place that people are getting their lending or doing their borrowing from and getting their lending from. But we also recognise the government has a role here, and we want it to be an enabling role to support particularly startup businesses, but also those who are looking to grow. So what we're looking at is whether that support is provided directly, if it's provided through an intermediary. It will inevitably be a mix of both. How do we ensure that small and medium enterprises access, for example, some of our research and development and innovation support? Because policies like the R&D tax credit are really good, but mainly at the larger end of the spectrum. And so we're taking another look at all of those areas where we want to be able to fuel that innovation engine. We also want to make sure that access to the skills and the training can be done via small businesses as well. The Flexi wage policy is another one that we brought in, feeling that we were going to need that largely because people would be out of work for a long period of time. But it is available to people to start businesses, and there are grants to be able to set up and move and grow as well. So that's another policy area where I think small and medium enterprises can take a look at. But yeah, I feel that we've given a good base for SMEs through the work we did through COVID, and we are confident that that we've got an environment in which SMEs can thrive. But I recognise those specific issues around access to finance, access to the R&D, access to skills will remain issues that we've got to work on together.
Exporters cannot travel as they cannot get MIQ slots. Surely business travellers should get MIQ priority and vaccination priority. Why is this not the case?
Oh, there's a lot in that question.
Yes.
Look, I absolutely get the frustration, and our first step, which was a remedial one, was to give NZTE significant funding boosts in budget 2020 to be able to be that in-market presence for exporters when they couldn't get there, because we do have that there. And so I encourage anyone who is struggling in that regard to talk to NZTE and try and use their good offices to be able to advance it if you can't get to a particular country. And NZTE has also been reaching back into New Zealand to work on, again, some of the online and digital versions of the export services they previously provided. But yeah, look, I absolutely get that. The issue we've got is that, as I said before, we've got to get the balance right between the very thing that's enabled the New Zealand economy to do so well, which is the fact that we have been very careful about our borders, against everybody wanting to now start coming and going, and also making sure that we get the labour force that we need coming in. We do allocate a proportion of our MIQ places around the critical worker category. And as I said before, we want to start moving to a position where we can enable more of that movement, but it does have to be done in a pretty careful and balanced way. When it comes to the vaccination program, again, we've got, a very large group of people who want to be vaccinated. The process we took was securing the border first, because that's for New Zealand, because we don't have COVID in the community. It's the border where we need to work, then those who work in our health system, and now we're working through those other areas. So as we open up, this is going to be the key to get everybody vaccinated. So I understand the frustration. Equally, we could fill MIQ on a given day for New Zealanders who want to come home. And even though it's been well over a year, there are plenty of New Zealanders out there who are still looking to come back into New Zealand. We have certain obligations to New Zealand citizens. The Bill of Rights Act says that New Zealand citizens have the right to return to New Zealand. That's something that not all countries have. And so we have to balance our legal obligations against all of the many sectors where we want people to come and go. So I get the frustration. I know that's probably not the answer you're looking for that question, but the more, as I say, we'll have a bit more to say in about a month's time around how we think we can move to a position where we can free up a bit more space and place for people to be able to come in and out of the country.
What if I throw this question in there a bit? This person here is talking about the rate of vaccinations and the ability to increase. Look, you're seeing overseas the incentives given to people to vaccinate. Look, is that something that the government would look at just to get that rate of vaccination? Although I know it's people, you need people to be able to.
I think at the moment that's not really an issue for us right now, in the sense that our plan is pretty careful and it's very calibrated against supply. So we're not sitting on huge supplies of vaccine that we can't get into people's arms. We have an arrangement with Pfizer where we learn about a month in advance the delivery schedule, and that delivery schedule is ramping up. Pfizer have a contract with us, which means that by around about the end of October, it's all got to be here. At that point, if we feel that we are in a position where we're not getting the uptake we want, we could look at all manner of things that we need to do. But right now, we've got way more people who want to be vaccinated than we have vaccine short for.
Okay.
The issue we've got is vaccine hesitancy has been something we've all been really worried about. The reality is it's reducing significantly, and more people are seeing the value of it. So I think the best thing all of us can do is actually just encourage our friends and our family that when you get the opportunity to have that vaccination, that you take it up. And for businesses out there, we talk about it in your workplace. If you've got people who are a bit hesitant, let us know. The percentage of our population that's anti-vax is actually very, very small.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's very small. But the survey work that we've been doing shows that there's a hesitancy among a group of people. They're not against it, but they're just saying, well, hang on a minute, this has come to market quicker than any vaccine in the world. Have you rushed it? The answer is we haven't rushed it, or the global scientific community haven't rushed it. It's just that for the first time in history, all of the minds were focused on the same thing, and we were able to make sure we accelerated that process. So, as I say, I back the strategy we've got for our vaccine. The reality was that in the early part of this year, we had countries where thousands of people were dying, and those countries got vaccines and gave one dose to their people. That doesn't fully protect you. New Zealand has a strategy of one vaccine, 2 doses, and we will get that done, and we will be in a strong position. And as I said before, that gives us options. But no, at the moment, we don't need that. I mean, we've had some of the discussions. I'm a big advocate of sort of, lotto style prizes for people, but we'll cross that bridge if we need to further down the track.
I did see a fellow who won $1 million.
I saw that. He was pretty excited.
Wasn't he just? Hey, this is an easy one for you, I think. Well, just a clarification. You mentioned Standard & Poor's rating for New Zealand was AAA. Has the AA plus rating assigned in Feb 21 been changed recently?
Yeah, it is AAA for local currency. Standard & Poor's. That means that puts them in line with both Fitch and Moody's for us. It's a pretty good sign, and I think it's really important. I didn't dwell on it in the early part of my presentation, but getting the balance right in terms of our fiscal policy is challenging. So New Zealand's level of debt is now significantly higher than it was where we'd got it to in 2019, which was under 20% of net debt, under 20% of GDP. The good news is that those May forecasts that Jared mentioned before see us peaking up in the 40s and then 2023 coming down. That relatively to the rest of the world is a position, still a very strong position. So my British counterpart, Rishi Sunak, produced a budget not long before mine with net debt at 100% of GDP. And the average around the OECD is much, much higher. So while we've increased our levels of debt, we actually are in a very strong position, and we will see that trend down. It's about the balance between that and what we invest now. And as Jared said, things are looking better, the tax take's better than we expected and so on. It does start to give us some options, but I'm a good Southern Presbyterian boy. I'm going to be pretty careful about that because of the volatility that we've got. So, New Zealand's a small country prone to natural disasters, prone to greater impacts from global economic shocks. We'll always want to see our debt be a bit lower, but I'm comfortable where it is at the moment. And Standard & Poor's and others are effectively endorsing that approach through those ratings upgrades.
A couple of questions here. I'll try and combine them. This won't be a surprise, I'm sure. The change to the interest deductibility rules on housing announced in March came into effect before specific detail on the policy was finalised. Rules around exemptions for new builds. Was there a specific reason these details were not finalised? The sudden introduction changes for residential investors is blunt. Far-reaching effects on those that have based long-term investment decisions around this. Is there recognition that the...
Is that one question or six?
Well, I'm just putting a few together, just the flavour. There's a few on this interest rate. Some people are saying, actually, is this a policy that falls unfairly?
Views. Yeah. Look, and I recognise it's a significant shift, but as I said earlier on in my comments, this time last year, we were still being told by Treasury, Reserve Bank and others that the bottom was going to fall out of the housing market. That obviously did not happen, and the opposite occurred. And from our perspective, that required interventions on both supply and demand side. I've run through some of the supply side stuff, but there's significant investment going on in public house building. We've got great numbers of consents now, and actually travelling around New Zealand as I have over the last month or two, I've been from Whangarei to Invercargill and many places in between post-budget, and there's a lot of house building going on. We just have to accelerate that and do all we can. So supply side's part of it, but we have to think about the demand side. We brought in the so-called foreign buyer ban, so offshore buyers not being able to buy into the existing residential housing market, bright line test extension. But in the end, we felt that if we really wanted to give first-time buyers a fair go, we had to do something, and interest deductibility was the place that we went. A couple of points in response. Firstly, it wasn't that the policy work hadn't been done, it was that we wanted to consult. And one of the lessons that we've learned in tax policy particularly is that the fine detail, we do need to be talking to those in the profession and those who are affected by it to make sure that the actual implementation of it achieves what we want, but doesn't have unintended consequences. So it wasn't that the work wasn't done, it was that it's good policy practice to actually do the consultation. 1st of October is actually the date of implementation, so we haven't got in front of that. Second point, there is a 4-year transition for people who currently use interest deductibility. So we reduce it by 25% a year. So that is the space for those people who have set themselves up in a particular way to be able to make the decision about what they want to do. So if you take it from the 1st of October, you've still got a whole nother year before you'll be on 75% ability to do it. That is, I think, a really important change, or a really important transition rather, for people to be able to make their decisions. The exemption on new builds, really important, because what we do want to do is actually create a tax incentive to add to the stock. And we've certainly had some really positive conversations with developers since the announcement of the policy about the fact that they think there are real opportunities there for people to shift their investment into building that new stock. but we have to get the fine detail of that right, and that's what the consultation's about. You know, how does a new build apply? Does it apply to the building or the person who built it? Does it, when it sells, what do you do? So they are the questions that we've been answering through the consultation process. So absolutely recognise the change and the fact that it will change some people's thought processes around where their investments lie, but we are giving ourselves the time to get the fine detail of it right.
And just my final comment on that, Minister, there are some in the House who go, as in your House, who say actually that was a tax loophole. Deductibility was not a loophole, it was allowed. So that changes, anyway, what you've gone on about. Question here about the first home grant.
Yes.
Available for people purchasing houses under 700k in Auckland. I live in Auckland. Person saying here that's way too low. Is there consideration of increasing that, given that the average house price in Auckland is 1.14? So I suppose point is you're having a policy, but actually can it really be applied?
So we want to make sure that we're basing those sorts of calculations on something meaningful. So we don't just make that up. It's taken from CoreLogic data. It's the median of the lower quartile of CoreLogic data. And one of the things we are looking at how we can tweak is how regularly we update that, because obviously it can shift significantly. Average house prices are not a great thing to be able to base those sorts of decisions on because of the skewing at the top end of that. So we do use the median of the lower quartile. So it means that there are homes available at that level. They may not be in exactly the places that people want, and they may not be exactly the properties that people want, but there are, you know, it is based on a particular formula for us. I recognise the fact that it moves fast and it's challenging and difficult to do that. People who are getting into the market are doing it through a combination of their KiwiSaver and what they can get from first home grants and so on. So there's a number of moving parts and different elements to it, but that is how we come to that particular calculation.
This is an easy one for you. In Budget 2021, you referenced the mother of all budgets in 1991. Were you disappointed Budget 2021 wasn't referenced as the father of all budgets?
No, I was not. Someone thought that it should have been called the daddy of all budgets, but it wasn't, and it wasn't my intention to do it. But no, I was a young student when the 1991 budget passed, so it was something I remembered, and we're very pleased to be able to make some of those changes, particularly around income support, that we thought were needed.
That was actually from one of my partners who has a sense of humour.
That's good. I'm pleased they do.
This is a loaded one. Do you expect inflation and interest rates to increase as a result of the supply chain issues, and what impact? I know there's a...
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, no one will be surprised that I have to be very careful about what I say about that. The Minister of Finance making comments, especially on the day of monetary policy released by the Reserve Bank and a couple of days before Stats New Zealand released their inflation data is not wise. I'm not privy to either of those, by the way, just to be very clear to people. Look, so I won't comment in detail on that. The question that every policymaker around the world, be they central bank policy makers doing monetary policy or finance ministers doing fiscal policy, is about whether or not we're going to see short-term temporary impacts or long-term impacts. And, you know, it's the job of the Reserve Bank literally to look through an immediate cycle to the medium and the long term. And so Adrian and his committee at the bank will be doing that, and we'll hear what they think about that later today. But that challenge of what is temporary and what is long term is really challenging. If I just make the question about the supply chain elements of it, as I said earlier, I think the supply chain issues are going to be with us for some time. Are they the big fueler of inflation? Well, there are other people who can debate that, but those supply chain issues aren't going away. One thing I would say is if you look at both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank's previous forecasts around inflation, they're still sitting within the band that we give the Reserve Bank, the 1% to 3% band. And so we've had just such low rates for a period of time, and interest rates and low inflation, that people are, I guess, in some ways comfortable and used to that. We'll see where we go over the next little while, but yeah, today's not the best day for me to speculate on matters like that.
Is government tracking fraud subsidy claim holders, and how many are prosecuted?
Wage subsidy, I presume that is. Yeah. Yes, and look, you will have some of you will have seen the Auditor General's comments on the process the Ministry of Social Development has been using for those investigations, and I know that that's been taken on board by MSD and they are pursuing that. There haven't been any prosecutions so far, and MSD's logic for that is they've done many investigations, and then at a certain point in the investigation, the person that they're investigating says, you know what, I'll just pay that back. And so that's been the process that's taken place. And I haven't checked recently, but a month or two ago, we were well over, I think, about $700 million having come back, via that process. But the Auditor General's point was, well, actually, you probably do need to follow through on some prosecutions. And so I know MSD is aware of that, and I know that they continue to look at it. We also run the resurgence support payment, which we've just had here in Wellington because we went up to level 2 for a little while. And as that a couple of days ago, that had paid out about $4 million to 2,000 odd businesses, mainly here in the Wellington region. IRD run that, and they do regular probity checks as they go through as well. So, yep, again, I'll stand by the decisions we made about the wage subsidy scheme. It was really important to get the money out, to give people that cash flow and that confidence. And we do need to follow that up with investigations and as the Auditor General would say, audit, although they didn't regard what MSD was doing as audit.
Yes, no.
Sorry, I'm in an auditor's office, so I should really say that. Someone's going to trademark the word audit shortly, but yeah, so they are tweaking their processes, but I think the high trust model was the right thing to do, and yes, we have to wear a little bit around the edges, but I wouldn't change that.
But I'm assuming, God forbid it ever happened again, you'd be tweaking that.
Oh yeah, we already have.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the Auditor General's report, he made a number of recommendations, some of which we'd already done.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that we do those checks. And bear in mind, it's a statutory declaration. So if you are filling it out incorrectly and knowingly incorrectly, that's fraud.
Yep.
And so, people do have to bear that in mind.
The Climate Change Commission is advocating an approach for 100% zero emissions. The cost to the economy is significant, as shown by, and you might have actually seen the coal imports. There was a news article this morning about that, the dirtiest coal. Why don't you pursue a course of action to be less costly, but achieve most of the gains, given New Zealand's impact on the climate change is minimal? It seems unjustifiably idealistic. I'm not sure what some of those less actions would be.
I guess, from our perspective, and I did cover a bit of this when I spoke before, we see this not only as the right thing to do for the planet and the right thing to do for future generations, it also does offer a significant opportunity. And New Zealand generates, in the region of 90% and rising of our electricity from renewable sources. The only thing preventing us actually from moving to 100% really is storage, and that's what the New Zealand battery project that we're looking at is about. I guess the reassurance I can give to the person who's asked this question is we see this as a transition. We're not flicking our fingers and doing that. And in fact, ironically, that's the reason why right now we will be bringing coal in, because that is the redundancy in our system. The way our system is set up now is that in a dry hydrological year, we use coal, we fire Huntley up. And unfortunately, we've had a dry hydrological year. And so therefore, that is the way the system works now. It's not the way we want it to work medium and long term, but in order to get ourselves to that point, we've got quite a lot of work to do to see how we can use other sources to fill that gap. I believe this is the right thing to do, and I do believe there are strong economic opportunities for us here. I just reflect on, for example, the area of hydrogen. Hydrogen-fueled vehicles are going to be a very important part of transport into the future, particularly for longer trips, particularly for heavier vehicles. New Zealand can be the home of green hydrogen, and before COVID, I was up in Japan at the Rugby World Cup. It's a tough life as Minister of Sport, and I signed off a couple of partnerships there with Japanese entities, companies interested in the development of hydrogen, and some of those are being worked on right now in New Zealand. So I think we've got to look at it through that lens. We've got to look at it through the opportunity lens, that we actually can grow some really high-paying jobs, profitable businesses out of the work we do in climate change.
Just touching on the supply chain issues you discussed, particularly with shipping lines, the question is, can you quickly expand on those discussions? Currently, we've opened new markets in Malaysia, but we've no availability of space, and we've had increased costs of 30% before we've even started.
Yeah, look, and it's tough. And like I said, I don't have an easy answer to it. You know, with the air freight scheme, the planes were flying, you know, were sitting there potentially not flying, and we could get them to fly by subsidising them. The boats and the ships are just not there. That's the issue for us, and even more than that, the containers. And so, you know, if there was an easy fix, we would have done it right now. What we're trying to do is see whether or not we can work with a group of people to you know, make better utilise the ships we have, and by that I mean, you know, who's using them and what freight's on them, and then where they might go. Yeah. You know, on their shipping routes.
Big coordination piece.
It is absolutely vast, and it's just one of those questions. Like politicians, we always want to be able to give you an answer. I do not have an easy answer on that. It is a global issue. We all know geographically where we sit in terms of freight routes, and you know, that means that we are at the end of a lot of people's journeys. So we're trying very hard to think about what the logistics of all of that are. And as I say, I know the freight companies themselves are desperately doing that. Is there another ship that we can get on board? If there is, let's use that collectively together and get it to go to the right places. If there's not, how do we maximise the utilisation that we can get, and both in terms of what's on the ship and where it's going? So we'll keep working on that, but there isn't an easy answer.
Minister, I'm just going to try and sum some of the frustrations that some of our clients have in this, well, I suppose all businesses have. And we're in times where I know uncharted waters. You don't have a script on this. We're making it up as we go. But lots of policy comes out, and at the moment you can chuck a whole lot of money at stuff. But we've got resource issues, and we've touched on those. I suppose for some of our businesses, it's having some clear direction and decision making. We've got businesses, if I just quickly look at the Auckland scenario, hanging on and waiting to say, well, what is going to happen with the light rail program? It goes on, it goes off, we're waiting for consultation. And businesses hang around to make, well, they can't hang around for too long to make a decision. Capital's got to be employed somewhere else, labour, buying capital, equipment, etc. And I suppose as we keep throwing policies out and money, it's actually going, hold it, where do we really want to go? We know RMA clogs up some stuff. It's most probably more a cry for give us some real good direction of where we're going and heading, and we'll all get in behind, because NZ businesses do get in behind.
Yeah, and I guess, look, I get the sentiment. I feel like we are doing that to the extent that it is possible to do it. So in terms of the RMA, the first draft of the new Act is out, the exposure draft of the Act is out, so people can see the direction we're going in. We've committed to the reforms by the end of this term. We don't want to get it wrong. We could rush a bill through Parliament and get it wrong. We've got the RMA fast track process at the moment, which a number of people are using, and I encourage people who've got developments and want to get on with them to have a look at that fast track consenting process, because it's worked really well for the people who've gone down that path. So, you know, I think the direction of travel there is clear. I think the pipeline of working in infrastructure is clear. If we get to the specifics of light rail, we're going to do it. So there's no doubt about that. The question is how we do it, and the exact route and so forth. And we've committed ourselves to effectively a 6-month process to get that right. Won't dwell on what happened last term in terms of why that wasn't completed last term, but we are now in a position to do that. But you know, people can have confidence that it's going to happen. It's just the detail of it that we're now consulting on, and we really do want Aucklanders to come with us on it. There's a little bit of a sense that wasn't happening previously. So sometimes specific projects like that, there will be that. So look, you know, we give as much certainty as we possibly can. But we do live in a very, very uncertain world.
I know we do. Minister, thank you very much. Time is up. I know you've got a pressing day on behalf of BDO clients and on behalf of the BDO partners. Thanks very much for coming in and spending some time with us. Thank you all for participating and for your questions. This is unfortunately some of those questions we will not be able to have answered, and this is not one of those occasions where we can fire them to the Minister and get those all answered. So have an enjoyable day for the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.
Cheers.
Thanks.
One of those news presenters at the end of the